chilling moment in the sentencing of one of America's most notorious serial killers, the sentencing of the Golden State Killer in California, confessing to 13 murders and more than 50 rapes in the 1970s and 80s.
April 24th, 2018, Citrus Heights, California, a suburb just outside Sacramento. A quiet street, a house with a well-kept yard where a 72-year-old retired grandfather lived alone. At some point that afternoon, investigators approached the property. They had been watching him for weeks. They had already confirmed what they needed to confirm. When he stepped outside, they identified themselves. He froze. He said something, 4 words that one officer would later repeat in court. "I did it." And then he added 6 more. "I destroyed all those lives."
Police announcing the capture of 72-year-old Joseph James DeAngelo, a man they say is the elusive Golden State Killer.
Joseph James DeAngelo, former police officer, Navy veteran, grandfather of 3, had just confessed to being one of the most prolific and elusive serial killers in the history of the United States. At least 13 murders, at least 50 rapes, across 11 California counties, over more than a decade, 1974 to 1986. The FBI had been hunting him for 20 years. Investigators had chased thousands of leads. He had left DNA at dozens of crime scenes, taunting proof that he existed. And for 40 years, that DNA matched no one. He had slipped through every net. He had lived normally. He had worked as a police officer. He had raised daughters. He had bounced grandchildren on his knee. He was hiding in plain sight, and the FBI could not find him. A genealogy website did.
Police arrested Joseph James DeAngelo on Tuesday after crime scene DNA partially matched a relative's on one of those sites.
But I want to introduce you to something before we go anywhere. One detail about this case that nobody could have predicted. Something that investigators didn't plan, that lawyers didn't orchestrate, that happened entirely by accident. In a police interview room, when a 72-year-old man who thought he was alone for a moment didn't realize he was still being recorded. What he said in that room, to himself, under his breath, believing no one could hear, is the most extraordinary moment of unintentional confession in modern criminal history. We'll get there. Keep it in the back of your mind. To understand what it meant to finally catch Joseph DeAngelo, you need to understand what California lived through for more than a decade.
In October of 1978, our officers were dispatched to a call based on a UPS driver actually delivering a package and seeing the victim lying in the living room.
It began in the summer of 1974, in the small Central Valley town of Visalia. A burglar, methodical, almost artistic in his precision, was breaking into homes at night while people slept. He never took much, sometimes jewelry, sometimes cash, sometimes just rearranged things to make his presence known. Police called him the Visalia Ransacker. He would commit at least 120 burglaries in Visalia. He would kill at least once. A man named Claude Snelling, who caught him trying to kidnap his daughter. The Visalia Ransacker evaporated. Then, in 1976, on the other side of the state, he reappeared. Sacramento, 1976. A new predator. The East Area Rapist, so named by police because his attacks were concentrated in the eastern suburbs of the city.
It was December 18th, 1976, and I was 15. That night, my parents went to a Christmas party. I went to play the piano. I heard a noise.
He would pry open a window or a sliding glass door in the middle of the night. He'd wait. When his victims woke, he was already there. He would bind them, victims and any male partner present. He was organized, methodical, and sadistic. Between 1976 and 1979, he committed at least 50 rapes across Northern California. Investigators noted he was white, probably in his late 20s, wore size 9 shoes, had type A blood. They noted something else. During at least one attack, he sobbed. During others, he spoke to his victims. During attack number 37, he said a name, over and over, in what sounded like rage. He said, "I hate you, Bonnie." Then he seemed to vanish from Northern California. In reality, he had migrated south. In Southern California, 1979 to 1986, a new terror emerged. The original Night Stalker. He was different now. He wasn't just raping, he was killing couples in their homes. He would bind them, execute them, then disappear into the dark. 12 murders. Southern California lived in fear of a killer who left no witnesses, no usable description, almost no trace. It wasn't until 2001, 15 years after his last known crime, that DNA testing finally confirmed what had been suspected but never proven. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person.
The rapes in Northern California stopped abruptly in 1979, with the attacker seemingly vanishing from the area.
And then, in 1986, he simply stopped. He didn't get caught. He didn't die. He walked away. He went home, wherever that was, and he became someone else. And for the next 32 years, an entire generation of investigators, detectives, federal agents, and one extraordinary true crime writer would chase a ghost. The ghost had a name. Michelle McNamara was a true crime writer from Chicago. She was funny, warm, married to actor and comedian Patton Oswalt, and obsessed in the most productive, methodical way with cold cases. In 2007, she came across the story of the East Area Rapist for the first time. By her own account, something shifted in her permanently. She wrote, "There's a scream lodged permanently in my throat now." She launched a blog, True Crime Diary. She began spending every spare hour reading through case files, reaching out to investigators, corresponding with other amateur sleuths on online cold case forums. She became, over the following years, one of the most knowledgeable private researchers on the case in the world.
She started the blog True Crime Diary, where she profiled both recent and long-forgotten crimes.
In 2013, she published a long-form article in Los Angeles magazine about the then unnamed killer. In that article, she gave him a new name. She called him the Golden State Killer. The name stuck. It resonated in a way that clinical police designations never had. And it did something investigators had been struggling to do for years. It brought the case back into public consciousness. Publishers came calling. She signed a book deal. She spent years buried in the research, 3,500 digital files, dozens of notebooks, 37 boxes of evidence from an Orange County prosecutor who trusted her. And then, on April 21st, 2016, Michelle McNamara died in her sleep. She was 46 years old. Her book was unfinished. The killer was still free. Her widower, Patton Oswalt, together with her researcher Paul Haynes and journalist Billy Jensen, spent 2 years completing her manuscript from the 3,500 files she left behind. I'll Be Gone in the Dark was published on February 27, 2018, 2 months before an arrest was made in the case.
Billy Jensen is a true crime journalist in Southern California.
You hear East Area Rapist / original Night Stalker, nobody knows what that is.
The title came from something the Golden State Killer said to a 15-year-old girl he was attacking in 1976. He told her, "You'll be silent forever, and I'll be gone in the dark." He was wrong about the silence part and about the dark. While Michelle McNamara was writing, and while investigators were chasing leads, Joseph James DeAngelo was living in Citrus Heights. He mowed his lawn. He drove to the grocery store. He had daughters and grandchildren. Neighbors described him as quiet, private, a little strange. He had worked as a police officer, first in Exeter, California, from 1973, then in Auburn. He was fired from Auburn in 1979 for shoplifting, dog repellent, and a hammer. He would later be connected to crimes where both items were relevant. But in 1979, no one connected the fired cop to the East Area rapist. Not yet. Here's what nobody outside his private world knew. His name had already come up in the investigation and been dismissed. We'll come back to that. The Bonnie detail turned out to be one of the most psychologically revealing elements of the entire investigation. In the early 1970s, DeAngelo had been engaged to a young woman named Bonnie Colwell, whom he'd met at Sierra College. She broke off the engagement. She had recognized something in him. She later described manipulative and abusive behavior, and she left. The wedding announcement from May 1970 still existed in old newspaper archives. DeAngelo married someone else, a woman named Sharon Huddle, in 1973. They had 3 daughters together. The marriage collapsed by the mid-1990s. And throughout the 1970s, while he was the East Area rapist, he was screaming a dead woman's name, a woman who was very much alive, who had simply had the good sense to walk away from him, into the dark of strangers' bedrooms. Retired Contra Costa County investigator Paul Holes, who had worked the case for more than 2 decades, described DeAngelo as an anger retaliatory offender. Not mentally ill in any clinical sense, fully aware of what he was doing, choosing his targets, choosing his weapons, choosing his moments, while simultaneously raising daughters in a Citrus Heights suburb, while navigating his estrangement from his wife, while doing the ordinary things ordinary people do. He held the 2 lives simultaneously. He had done so for more than a decade. Then he stopped. Here is where this case stops being a true crime story and becomes something else entirely. Something that will define how law enforcement operates for the next century. In 2017, investigators working the cold case made a decision that had never been made before in a major American murder investigation. They took the Golden State Killer's DNA, the profile that had been sitting in evidence for 40 years, matching nothing, and they uploaded it to a public genealogy website called GEDmatch. GEDmatch was built by hobbyists, people who wanted to find cousins, people who were curious about their ancestry, people who had no idea their DNA upload would one day help catch a serial killer.
In the United States, there are no regulations on software-modeled DNA portraits. In France, its use is limited and subject to judicial review.
A genealogist named C.C. Moore, working with investigators, ran the Golden State Killer's DNA through GEDmatch and found distant relatives, people who shared enough genetic material to suggest they were second or third cousins of the suspect. From there, she and investigators built a family tree. Not a small family tree, a family tree of more than 1,000 names. Then they began the painstaking work of narrowing it down.
We've seen a lot of people that shared DNA with this suspect that had 4 Puerto Rican grandparents or 8 Puerto Rican great-grandparents.
Cross-referencing age, geographic location, military records, physical descriptions, criminal records. The 1,000 names became hundreds. The hundreds became dozens. the dozens became 3. One of those 3 names was Joseph James DeAngelo, a 72-year-old retired police officer living in Citrus Heights, California, a suburb of Sacramento, right where the East Area Rapist had first operated. He was the right age. He was the right geography. He had worked in law enforcement, which would explain his knowledge of police procedure. And he had a criminal record, the 1979 shoplifting charge in Auburn, which had ended his policing career. Investigators put him under surveillance. They waited. And one day, Joseph DeAngelo threw something in his trash can, a tissue. He had no idea they were watching. He had no idea what a tissue could do. The tissue matched. The DNA from the tissue matched the DNA from the crime scenes, from 40-year-old rapes and murders across the state of California. The past met the present that day, Sacramento District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert would say. DNA became the voice of the victims. In 1996, a Contra Costa County investigator named Larry Poole was working the East Area Rapist cold case. He compiled a list of suspects based on geographic overlap, physical description, and other criteria. Joseph DeAngelo's name was on that list. A detective reviewed him and crossed him off. The reason? A background check showed he had no violent criminal record, only the 1979 misdemeanor shoplifting charge. Nobody dug further. Nobody tested his DNA against the crime scene profile. He was crossed off a list in 1996 and lived freely for another 22 years. If that detective had ordered a DNA test, the Golden State Killer could have been caught in 1996. 45 victims later, 40 lives of trauma and grief that never needed to happen. This case is being told as a story about DNA and genealogy websites, and it is that story. But underneath that story is a more disturbing one. Joseph DeAngelo committed at least 13 murders and 50 rapes while being a police officer. He was enforcing the law by day and terrorizing families by night. He knew exactly how investigations worked. He knew what evidence to avoid leaving. He knew how law enforcement communicated and didn't communicate across jurisdictions. The question this case actually asks is not, how did the DNA catch him? The question is, how does someone hold 2 lives simultaneously for 30 years and never once break? No confession to a friend, no diary, no drunken slip, nothing. Just silence. Until, in a room he thought was empty, he couldn't help himself. After his arrest, DeAngelo was placed in a police interview room. He was read his rights. Investigators came and went, and at some point, when DeAngelo believed he was alone, when the room appeared empty and the questioning had paused, a recording was still running. What he said in that room, to himself, under his breath, has been described in court proceedings by prosecutors. He said, "I did all those things. I destroyed all those lives." And then there's the podcast angle, the detail that gives this video its title. Because while investigators and genealogists and true crime writers had been circling this case for years, it was the true crime podcast community that kept the Golden State Killer in public consciousness long enough for the technology to catch up. Shows like My Favorite Murder covered the East Area Rapist in their very first episode. Michelle McNamara's work was publicized through podcasts, interviews, and online communities. The collective obsession of millions of amateur investigators, people who had nothing but curiosity and internet access, created a sustained public pressure that helped push investigators back to the case. He was caught by a genealogy website, but he was never forgotten because of a podcast. Between his arrest in April 2018 and his guilty plea in June 2020, DeAngelo said almost nothing publicly. He sat in a wheelchair in courtroom appearances, a wheelchair prosecutors contended was a prop. Jail video, later obtained by reporters, showed him walking with no difficulty whatsoever.
This is June 1st, just a couple weeks before. Watch it for what he does. Watch his flexibility, watch his dexterity, watch his mental drive.
Even in custody, even charged with 13 murders, he was performing. He was managing his image. He was doing what he had always done. But in August 2020, the performance finally ended. And what happened in that Sacramento University ballroom across 3 days of hearings is one of the most extraordinary scenes in the history of American criminal justice. June 29, 2020. DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 rape-related charges under a plea deal that would spare him the death penalty and guarantee life without parole.
The defendant, Joseph DeAngelo, will enter a guilty plea to all charged counts. The defendant will plead guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder. The family members of the murder victims have waited for decades for justice for their loved ones.
As part of the deal, he was required to publicly admit to all of the crimes, including dozens of sexual assaults for which the statute of limitations had expired. He stood in court and said, "I admit," again and again and again. Prosecutors called the scale of the violence simply staggering. 87 victims at 53 crime scenes spanning 11 California counties. Before a judge sentenced him, the victims got their moment.
My safety was shattered as a masked man, DeAngelo, yielding a knife, told me he would kill me if I didn't do what he demanded.
August 18th through 20th, 2020. Because COVID-19 had made a traditional courtroom impossible to accommodate the number of people involved, Judge Michael Bowman held the victim impact hearings in a ballroom at California State University, Sacramento. A university ballroom, large enough for the survivors and their families. For 3 days, one by one, they stood up and spoke directly to Joseph James DeAngelo. Peggy Frink had been 15 when he tied her up and raped her. She stood and said, "My God, we were just high school kids going to school. Now, finally, the end of this trauma is here. He's a horrible man, and none of us need to worry about him anymore."
I was hit several times on the head before being tied up, gagged, and blindfolded. We were both threatened, and I was raped multiple times.
One victim's daughter walked to the podium, looked at DeAngelo, and made an obscene gesture, and the courtroom erupted. Then Bonnie appeared. Bonnie Yultsen, the woman DeAngelo had screamed at in the dark for years. She was 69. She was not permitted to personally deliver a statement, but her friend, Jane Carson Sandler, herself a rape survivor, the fifth woman DeAngelo had attacked, spoke for her.
"You blindfolded me and then gagged me with a cloth. Remember that? But you also did the same to my precious 3-year-old son. How dare you?"
Carson Sandler told DeAngelo, "When she saw who you really were, she was done with you. When you thought you could kidnap her and force her to marry you, even a gun pointed at her face could not make her choose you." The courtroom held its breath. Bonnie Yultsen stood up from her seat, removed her mask, and stared directly at DeAngelo across the room. He stared straight ahead. He did not look at her. Orange County District Attorney Todd Spitzer approached the podium and addressed DeAngelo directly. As he was destroying your lives, he got to be on his boat, blow out birthday candles, hold his granddaughter. Patty Cosper, the daughter of rape victim Patricia Murphy, sang to DeAngelo as she left the podium. "Bye-bye, Joe, don't cry. May you rot in prison." On August 21, 2020, Judge Michael Bowman sentenced Joseph James DeAngelo to multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Before reading the sentence, Bowman addressed the gallery. "The survivors have spoken clearly. The defendant deserves no mercy." Then, to everyone's shock, DeAngelo rose from his wheelchair. He removed his mask. He faced the court, and in a voice stronger and steadier than anyone had heard from him in any court appearance, he said, "I listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt."
"I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt."
The courtroom gasped. Then it exhaled. It was more than 1,000 days too late, but in a room full of people who had waited 40 years, it landed. He sat back down, and the judge took the rest away from him. DeAngelo is currently serving his sentence at Corcoran State Prison in California. His 3 daughters and grandchildren exist with the knowledge of what their father and grandfather was.
I felt really sick. I just felt very nauseated.
His ex-fiancée Bonnie, who saw something in him 50 years ago and walked away, watched him be sentenced to life in prison. And somewhere in those Citrus Heights streets, the neighbors who described him as quiet and private are still processing what lived next door to them. But before we close, there is one more thing. The detail I asked you to hold at the beginning. The room, the recording, the thing he said when he thought no one was listening. At the very start of this video, I told you that in a police interview room, on the day of his arrest, Joseph DeAngelo said something he didn't know was being recorded. Here is why that moment matters beyond its content. In 40 years, across 13 murders, across 50 rapes, across 100 burglaries, across a double life maintained with the precision of a man who had once been trained to catch criminals, DeAngelo had never said a word about what he had done. Not to a friend, not to a family member, not in a journal, until that room. And in that room, when the investigators left, and when the recording continued without him knowing, something in him that had held for 4 decades, "I did all those things." He went quiet again. He held it for 2 more years. He learned to perform helplessness in a wheelchair. He gave nothing else away until the guilty plea forced it out of him officially. The Golden State Killer was caught not by greater police intelligence, not by a witness, not by a confession, but by the invisible threads of biology that connect every human being to every other human being. Michelle McNamara never got to see it. She died 2 years before the arrest. She gave him a name the world could use. She put his face, faceless as it was, into the public imagination. She kept the pressure on in an era when cold cases were supposed to stay cold. And on the night DeAngelo was taken into custody, her widower, Patton Oswalt, posted one thing online: a picture of Michelle with 4 words. She didn't know yet. She never knew, but she helped make it happen.